The scan is done. I'm in the middle of something. You need to come look at this right now. Medic Sora Vel had been running intake scans at Crossroads Station's medical bay for 6 years. She had processed 14,000 patients across 31 species. She had seen unusual results before. Unusual was part of the job. The outer stations attracted the kind of people whose bodies told complicated stories, frontier workers with injury histories that predated their coalition registration, and travelers who had spent years in environments that left marks the standard baseline charts didn't account for, species whose physiology was still being documented by coalition medical science. Unusual did not make her call her supervisor. She called her supervisor when the scan finished running on the human in Bay 3, and the results panel displayed a set of numbers that she read 3 times, in sequence before picking up the comm. His name per his registration was Davin Holt. He was 34 years old and listed as an independent freight operator out of the outer settlement network, and he had come into the medical bay that morning with a standard request, pre-clearance physical for a new cargo contract that required a clean medical sign-off, routine, and the kind of appointment that took 20 minutes and produced paperwork nobody read carefully. Sora had started the scan without particular attention. She had done this 14,000 times. The scanner ran, the results populated, she reviewed them, she signed off or she flagged, and the patient went on their way. The scanner ran. The results populated, she did not sign off. Welcome to HFY universe, where the galaxy keeps discovering things about humanity one medical scan at a time. Subscribe right now because this one builds exactly the way the title says it does. Let's go back to Bay 3. Supervisor Irith arrived 3 minutes after the comm. He was Veshan, 20 years in Coalition Medical Administration, and the kind of professional whose default expression was the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to react visibly to things until he understood them. He had come because Sora had asked him to, and because she had used a tone on the comm that he had not heard from her in 6 years of working the same shift. She showed him the results panel without saying anything. Just turned the screen toward him and waited. Irith looked at the panel, and then he looked at the patient sitting calmly on the Bay 3 examination table, who was reading something on a small personal device and had not looked up since the scan finished. Then he looked at the panel again. "Run it again," he said. "I ran it 3 times before I called you," Sora said, "and same results each time." Irith studied the numbers in the specific way of a professional whose training was telling him one thing and whose I am something else entirely. The bone density reading was the first number that had stopped Sora. It was not, on its own, impossible, and some human populations showed elevated bone density as an environmental adaptation to high-gravity settlements, but the number on the panel was not elevated baseline. It was a category above elevated baseline, and in a range that the scanner's reference chart listed as physically implausible for a biological organism without structural augmentation. There was no augmentation listed in the patient's file. The muscle fiber density reading was the second number. It told a similar story in different units, and that Irith looked at it for a long time before he said anything. "Is resting cardiac output," he said. "Yes," Sora said. "That's an active exertion reading. It's his resting number," Sora said. "I checked the calibration twice." Irith set down the chart, and then he picked it up again. "What does he do?" "Freight operator," Sora said. "Independent, outer settlements." Irith looked at the patient again, and Davin Holt had finished whatever he was reading and was now looking at the ceiling with the patient expression of someone accustomed to waiting for things to happen on other people's timelines. He looked, to all visual observation, like a man in his mid-30s of average build and slightly weathered from outdoor work, unremarkable in every way that eyes could measure. The scanner disagreed with every assessment eyes could make. Irith made a decision. He picked up his own comm and contacted Director Meven, and Director Meven ran the medical division for the entire Crossroads Station complex. She had held the position for 11 years, which meant she had seen most of what a station this size and this traffic volume could produce in the way of medical anomalies. And she arrived at Bay 3 7 minutes after Irith's comm, which was fast for someone whose schedule did not accommodate interruptions easily. She looked at the panel. She looked at the patient. She looked at Irith. "You confirmed calibration," she said. 3 times, Sora said, from the corner, and since the question was clearly directed at whoever had done the calibrating, Meven studied the results with the focused attention of someone reading a document she intended to remember precisely. The pain response index was the number that stopped her. It was at the bottom of the panel, easy to miss if you were focused on the structural readings above it. Sora had almost missed it herself. Almost. The index measured neurological pain response sensitivity on a standardized scale. The coalition baseline for most species clustered in a range between 70 and 30, with variations accounted for by species, age, and environmental history. Humans typically range between 80 and 120. The number was expressed as sensitivity. Higher meant more sensitive, lower meant less. Davin Holt's pain response index was 31. "That's not a biological number," Meven said. "No," and Irith agreed. "It isn't." "Has he reported any symptoms, any history of neurological conditions?" "He came in for a pre-clearance physical," Sora said. He said he felt fine. He said he always feels fine. Meven looked at the patient one more time. He had noticed, and at some point in the past several minutes, that the number of medical staff gathered around the screen displaying his results had increased, and he had the expression of someone who had seen this particular sequence of events before and found it more tedious than alarming. "Mr. Holt," Meven said, and he looked over. "Director," he said, reading her rank insignia with the ease of someone familiar with coalition medical hierarchy. "Is there a problem with the sign-off?" "We have some questions about your results," Meven said carefully. "Sure," he said, and set his personal device in his pocket in the manner of someone settling in for a conversation they had had before. The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes. Meven asked the questions, and Davin answered them with the specific quality of someone being cooperative and accurate, while also being clearly aware that the answers were not going to make anything simpler. He had grown up on a frontier settlement in the outer reach. Third generation, and his grandparents had been among the original settlers, which meant his family had spent 3 generations in an environment that the Coalition's environmental classification system rated as high stress, high physical demand, and low medical access. And the kind of settlement where the gap between what hurt and what stopped you was a distinction people learned to make early, because the alternative was stopping. He had been doing physical labor since he was 12, not the managed, structured physical training of academy programs or military preparation. The specific kind of work that frontier settlements required from anyone old enough to contribute irregular, demanding, and performed in conditions that varied from difficult to actively hostile depending on the season and the equipment situation. He had never had a full medical scan before this appointment. The settlement he grew up on had basic medical capability, and basic did not include the full-spectrum scanner that Crossroads Station's Bay 3 used for pre-clearance physicals. "Nobody has ever scanned you comprehensively," Meven said. "First time for everything," Davin said, without particular drama. "Your pain response index," Meven said. "And the number we're seeing, do you experience pain normally?" He thought about this with the seriousness of someone trying to give an accurate answer to a question they had never been asked directly. "I experience it," he said. "I just don't usually stop for it." Meven wrote something on her chart, and then she looked at what she had written and wrote something else. "The bone density reading," she said. "Is that unusual?" "For any species in the Coalition's medical database," Meven said, "yes." And he absorbed this with the mild interest of someone receiving information that explained something they had wondered about without spending much time on. "That might be why I don't float well," he said. Irith, standing to the left of Meven, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite anything else. "You don't float well," Meven repeated. "In water," Davin said. "I sink, always have, assumed it was a technique problem." He considered this. Maybe not. Meven filed her initial report that evening, and it was flagged automatically by the Coalition medical database system because 3 of the readings fell outside the parameters the system was programmed to accept as biological without augmentation. The flag generated a notification to the Coalition Xenobiology Research Division, which was standard procedure for readings that the database couldn't categorize. The Xenobiology Division sent a response the following morning. The response was from a senior researcher named Dr. Orvith, who had been in the field for 30 years and whose messages were typically brief and professionally neutral. This one was neither. It asked, in 4 increasingly direct paragraphs, whether the scan results had been verified, whether the patient was still on station, and whether Meven could confirm no augmentation was present, and whether it would be possible to schedule a follow-up assessment as soon as practically possible. The 4th paragraph ended with a sentence that Meven read twice. "If these numbers are accurate and unaugmented, and this patient represents the most significant human physiological documentation we have encountered in 11 years of research, and I would like to be present for any further evaluation." Meven forwarded the message to Irith. Irith forwarded it to Sora, and Sora read it and then went and stood in the corridor for a few minutes thinking about the fact that she had almost not called her supervisor. Devon was still on station. His cargo contract didn't start for 3 days, which meant he had time, and when Meven contacted him to explain the situation and ask if he was willing to participate in a follow-up assessment, he said yes without hesitation, and asked if the follow-up would take longer than a morning because he had a supply pickup in the afternoon. It took 2 days. And Dr. Orvith arrived from the Research Division's nearest outpost 18 hours after Meven's confirmation message. She brought 2 colleagues and a portable assessment unit that was significantly more detailed than Crossroads Station's standard scanner. And she was a Keth scientist of the specific variety that moved through unfamiliar environments with the focused efficiency of someone who had already mentally reorganized the space to suit the work. She introduced herself to Davin, explained what the assessment would involve, and asked if he had any questions before they began. He asked if there was somewhere he could get coffee during the breaks. There was. The assessment proceeded, and Dr. Orvith's 2 colleagues were younger researchers who had worked with her for 3 and 5 years respectively, and who had been briefed on the scan results before arriving. They had both expressed in the transit from the outpost varying degrees of professional skepticism, not about Meven's competence, but about the likelihood that the numbers were what they appeared to be, because numbers that fell outside the documented biological range usually had a simpler explanation than the documentation suggested. By the end of the first morning, neither of them was expressing skepticism. The portable unit was more precise than the station scanner and produced results that were, if anything, more pronounced than the initial readings rather than less. The bone density came back higher on the more sensitive equipment. The cardiovascular output confirmed at the same level. The pain response index confirmed at 31, and then the portable unit ran a secondary neurological assessment that the station scanner hadn't included, and that result produced a 20-minute conversation between the three researchers that Davin sat through with the patience of someone who had learned that scientific conversations needed to run their course. When the conversation ended, and Dr. Orvith's younger colleague, the one who had been most skeptical on the transit, sat down across from Davin and said, with the directness of someone abandoning their prepared professional neutrality, "How are you not aware of this? Of what specifically?" Davin said. And the colleague gestured at the assessment unit, at the numbers on the screen, at all of it. "I knew I was built differently," Davin said. "Frontier life does that. Everyone I grew up with was the same." The colleague looked at Dr. Orvith. Dr. Orvith made a note on her chart without looking up. "That," and she said, "is the most important thing he's said so far. Write it down." What the portable unit produced over 2 days of comprehensive evaluation was a document that Dr. Orvith would later describe to her research colleagues in a message she wrote at the end of the second day as the most complete physiological case study of environmental human adaptation I have encountered in 30 years of research, and the subject had no idea any of it was happening. The bone density was documented and explained 3 generations of high-gravity frontier work, and compounding across each generation, producing a skeletal structure that the research team's modeling suggested was approximately 40% denser than the coalition baseline for humans. Not augmented, adapted. The distinction mattered significantly to the research division's classification system, and the cardiovascular output was documented and explained same cause, different expression. A heart that had been working harder than baseline for 3 generations, in a lineage that had selected naturally and without intervention for the individuals who could sustain that output longest, and the pain response index was documented. The explanation was more complex, involving a combination of neurological adaptation and what Dr. Orvith described in her notes as a learned regulatory system that appears to have become partly structural over 3 generations of consistent application, and she spent 4 pages on it. The summary version was that Davin's nervous system had, over the course of his lifetime and his family's before him, developed a relationship with pain signals that was functionally different from the coalition baseline. Not an absence of sensation, and a different processing priority. On the morning of the second day, between assessments, Dr. Orvith sat across from Davin in the medical bay's small waiting area with 2 cups of the station coffee he had asked about and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," he said. "Were you aware of any of this before this week?" He thought about it. "I knew I was harder to hurt than most people," he said. "Figured that was just how I was built." "It is how you are built," Dr. Orvith said. "The question is why? Frontier life," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right. 3 generations of it." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Mr. Holt, the results we've documented this week are going to be published in the Coalition Medical Research Record. With your permission. They represent something we haven't seen before, and the research community needs to know it exists." He considered this with the same unhurried attention he had given every question over 2 days. "Will it affect my cargo contract?" "It shouldn't," Meven said from the doorway, and where she had apparently been standing long enough to hear the end of the conversation. "Then that's fine," Davin said. He finished his coffee and stood up. "Same time this morning?" "Same time," Dr. Orvith confirmed. He went to get a second cup, and she watched him go with the expression of a researcher who had spent 30 years looking for something and had found it in a man who came in for a pre-clearance physical and wanted to know if there was coffee. The paper was published 4 months later. It ran to 61 pages including appendices, which was long for a single-subject case study, and it generated more response from the coalition medical and xenobiology community than anything Dr. Orvith had published in her career. The response was not uniform, and some researchers pushed back on the methodology, which was expected. A 2-day single-subject assessment was not the standard basis for conclusions about an entire species population, and the research community said so clearly in the peer commentary section. Dr. Orvith had anticipated this and had included in the paper's limitation section a 4-paragraph acknowledgement of exactly those concerns, along with a recommendation for a broader study of frontier settlement populations that she intended to lead herself. And the pushback on methodology did not extend to the numbers. The numbers were documented, verified, and reproducible. Nobody argued with the numbers. What generated the most discussion in the months after publication was the final line of the conclusion. It appeared in 14 subsequent papers and cited as a framing device for research that ranged from human physiological classification to broader questions about how the Coalition's medical baseline system had been constructed and what assumptions were embedded in it. And 2 researchers used it as the opening line of papers that had nothing to do with humans specifically, because the point it made applied to their own species in ways they found useful. Dr. Orvith kept a copy of the original results panel from Bay 3 on her office wall. Not a printout of the paper, and the raw scan results exactly as Sora had seen them on the morning she reached for the comm. She had asked Meven for a copy before she left Crossroads Station, and Meven had sent it without asking why Sora Vel received a copy of the paper. She read it on a Tuesday afternoon between patient appointments and sitting at the desk in Bay 3 where she had first looked at the results panel and reached for her comm. The paper's conclusion noted that the findings represented a significant expansion of the documented range of human physiological adaptation, and that the subject's results challenged several baseline assumptions in the Coalition's current human medical classification system, and that further research into frontier settlement populations was strongly recommended. The final line of the conclusion said, "The subject's most notable characteristic was not any individual measurement, but the combination of physiology that had been quietly building toward these results for 3 generations, in a settlement that had no medical facility capable of measuring it. And the Coalition has been classifying humans for 31 years. It is possible we have been measuring the wrong things." Sora read that line twice, then she saved the paper to her personal files and went back to work. And the pre-clearance sign-off for Davenholt's cargo contract had been processed on day 3, before the full assessment was complete. He had made his afternoon supply pickup on schedule. His delivery record, per the freight operator registry, showed no late arrivals in 6 years of operation, and his medical file now had a notation that flagged it for specialist review at any Coalition facility he visited. He had not yet needed to use it. He had, however, stopped wondering why he sank in water. Some questions it had answers. They just needed the right equipment to find them. And that is the story for today. Drop a comment and tell me, what do you think Sora felt when she read that final line of the paper? Because I think about that moment a lot, and I want to know what you think went through her head. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. And 2 seconds of your time means everything to a growing channel. And if you are not subscribed to HFY Universe yet, do it now. New stories every week, and the next one is already being written. Until then, stay human. Even when you have no idea what that actually means yet, especially then.